I had always believed in loyalty, in the vows I had spoken, in the trust that built the foundation of my marriage. My husband and I had been together for years, and while things weren't always perfect, I never questioned my commitment. He was a good man, kind, hard-working, steady, the type of partner anyone would feel lucky to have. Our life was predictable, safe, and I had never given a single thought to stepping outside the boundaries of our marriage. His best friend had been in our lives for just as long, someone who had always been around, present at every milestone, woven into the fabric of our relationship like family. He was different from my husband, more outspoken, more carefree, the kind of man who drew attention without even trying. He had always been friendly, always made me laugh, but I had never looked at him as anything more than my husband's closest companion, until the day he needed me. It started with a message, short and simple, asking if we could talk. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing that made me hesitate. When he showed up at my door, his expression was tired, troubled, a side of him I had never really seen before. He didn't go into details right away, just thanked me for taking the time to listen. I told him, without a second thought, that of course I would help in any way I could. That was what friends did. He spoke about a situation that had been weighing on him, something personal, something he couldn't talk to my husband about. He needed someone to confide in, someone to understand him, someone to be there. I listened, offered comfort, reassured him that he wasn't alone. He looked at me differently then, not just with gratitude, but with something deeper, something I should have recognized as a warning. I didn't see it then, didn't understand the path I was about to walk. It was just a conversation, just a moment between friends. But looking back, I realized that was the first step, the moment where everything started to shift. I had invited something into my life without knowing it, opened a door that should have remained closed. And before I even knew what was happening, I was already too close to the edge. He sat across from me, shoulders heavy with an invisible weight, eyes filled with something unspoken. I had never seen him like this before, always the confident one, always the man who carried himself with ease. But tonight he looked different, like someone who had been carrying far too much for far too long. At first he hesitated, as if debating whether to speak at all. I could see the struggle in his expression, the way he searched for the right words, but found none. I assured him it was okay, that he could talk to me, that I would listen. And then, slowly, he began to unravel. He spoke about feeling lost, about things not going the way he had hoped. His career, his relationships, his sense of purpose. It all felt like it was slipping through his fingers. For the first time, he admitted he wasn't as strong as he had always pretended to be. He talked about the loneliness, the fear that maybe he had been making all the wrong choices, that he had no idea where his life was heading anymore. I sat there, absorbing every word, feeling something shift inside me. His pain was raw, unfiltered, the kind of honesty people rarely allowed themselves to show. And in that moment, I wasn't thinking about right or wrong, about boundaries or consequences. I was only thinking about how much he needed someone to listen, someone to understand. I told him he wasn't alone, that life had a way of sorting itself out, that he was stronger than he realized. My words weren't rehearsed or forced. They came naturally, as if comforting him was something I was meant to do. And when he looked at me then, really looked at me, something unspoken passed between us. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Not as a wife, not as someone's partner, but as a woman who could still make someone feel safe, wanted, understood. The warmth of his presence, the intensity of his gaze, the way he seemed to hold on to every word I said. It stirred something deep inside me, something I had almost forgotten existed. I should have recognized it then. I should have seen the warning signs, the quiet way the space between us was shrinking. But I didn't. Instead, I told myself I was only helping, that there was nothing more to it than that. I had no idea that in offering him comfort, I had also opened a door I wouldn't know how to close. The change was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. A lingering glance that lasted a second too long, a pause in conversation that carried something unspoken. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it, that I was simply reading too much into a moment of vulnerability. He had been hurting, and I had been there to listen. That was all. But the air between us had shifted. There was something in the way he looked at me now, a weight behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. When he spoke, his voice held a softness, a warmth that made my pulse quicken. He wasn't just talking anymore, he was paying attention, studying me as if he were seeing me in a way he never had before. I tried to push the thought away, to convince myself that it was all in my head. I was just being supportive, offering comfort to someone who needed it. There was no harm in that, but deep down I knew I was lying to myself. The next time he reached out, it was late. My husband was already asleep, unaware of the message lighting up my phone. Can't sleep. You up? I hesitated before answering, my fingers hovering over the screen. There was nothing wrong with checking in, nothing wrong with offering a few words of reassurance, so I replied. That conversation lasted longer than it should have. What started as simple words of comfort became something else entirely. He opened up in ways he never had before, and I found myself hanging on to every word, feeling a pull I didn't want to name. The way he spoke, the way he made me feel like I mattered, was something I hadn't realized I had been missing. Then came the moment when his words took a different tone. I don't think I've ever told you this, but you're incredible. I felt my breath catch. It was harmless, wasn't it? A compliment, nothing more. But there was something about the way he said it, the quiet certainty in his voice that made my skin warm. I could have shut it down. I could have ignored the meaning behind his words, drawn a line before it was too late. But instead, I let myself sit in the moment, let the thrill of feeling seen, wanted, desired, settle inside me. I told myself I was only being kind, that nothing had changed. But in reality, everything had already begun to slip beyond my control. It started with something small, something that should have meant nothing. A touch, barely noticeable, fleeting, innocent enough to be dismissed. His hand brushed against mine as he reached for his drink, and instead of pulling away, I let it linger for just a second too long. It was a mistake, a silent acknowledgement of something we both felt but had yet to say aloud. My heart pounded, my breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to act as if nothing had happened. I smiled, continued the conversation, pretended I hadn't felt the way his fingers hesitated against mine. But the moment had already passed between us, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it had changed everything. After that night, avoiding him became impossible. Every glance carried a new weight, every exchange was filled with an energy that neither of us addressed but both understood. I should have walked away then, created distance before we reached the point of no return. Instead, I convinced myself it was harmless. But the next mistake was bigger. It happened when we were alone, in a space where no one could see, where the silence between us was heavy with everything unspoken. He stepped closer, too close, his presence overwhelming. I should have turned away, should have said something to stop what was coming, but I didn't. I stayed still, waiting, knowing exactly what was about to happen. His fingers brushed my cheek, a slow and careful movement, almost as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I let him tilt my face toward his, my pulse racing, my thoughts already drowning in guilt. Then, without hesitation, his lips met mine. The kiss was soft, hesitant at first, testing the moment. But when I responded, when I allowed myself to lean into the warmth, into the thrill of something forbidden, it deepened, growing into something reckless, something dangerous. The second it ended, reality crashed down on me. My stomach twisted, my hands trembled. Guilt wrapped around me like a suffocating weight, whispering that I had gone too far. I whispered, "This can't happen again." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. Because deep down, I had already decided that once wasn't enough. What should have been a single mistake quickly turned into something neither of us could stop. The kiss haunted my thoughts, replaying over and over, making it impossible to pretend it had never happened. I told myself it was just a moment of weakness, something that would pass, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next time we were alone, we didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't acknowledge the lines we had crossed or the risk we were taking, but we didn't need to. The way we looked at each other said everything. The tension between us had changed. It wasn't hesitation anymore, it was anticipation. We found excuses to see each other more often. A quick stop by his place, a meeting that didn't really need to happen, a simple favour that gave us a reason to be alone. Every interaction felt electric, charged with an energy that made my heart race. What should have felt wrong, what should have filled me with guilt, only made me crave more. It started with stolen moments, a touch that lasted too long, a glance that lingered, a whisper meant only for me. Then came the late-night messages, the ones that made it impossible to sleep, the ones that set fire to a part of me that had been numb for so long. Every text, every hidden exchange, every excuse to talk just a little longer pushed us deeper into something we should have never started. At home, I became distant. My husband noticed, but I convinced him nothing was wrong. I smiled more, pretended things were normal, distracted him with conversation, so he wouldn't see what was really happening. I told myself I wasn't hurting him, that as long as he never found out, it didn't count as betrayal. Lying became easy. The thrill outweighed the guilt. The risk made it even more addictive. It was like stepping into another world, one where nothing else mattered except the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel like the only thing that existed. I convinced myself I was in control, that I could stop whenever I wanted. But the truth was, I had already lost control the moment I let the affair begin. The cracks in my carefully crafted lie started appearing before I even realized it. At first they were small, insignificant things that I convinced myself no one would notice. A delayed response to a simple question, an unnecessary excuse for why I had been out longer than expected. I had told myself that as long as I acted normal, as long as I played the role of the devoted wife, no one would ever suspect a thing. But my husband did. He didn't accuse me outright, didn't confront me with anger or suspicion. Instead, he started noticing things. The way my mind wandered during conversations, the way my phone never left my side, the way I seemed to be somewhere else even when I was sitting right in front of him. One evening, as I sat across from him at dinner, I caught him watching me. Not in the way he used to, not with warmth or admiration, but with quiet curiosity, as if he were studying something just out of reach. My stomach tightened, but I forced a smile, pretending I didn't feel the weight of his gaze. "You seem distracted lately," he said, his tone light but probing. I laughed it off, brushing it aside with an excuse about being busy, about work, about anything other than the real reason. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. The tension followed me everywhere. A friend made a casual comment. "You look different lately, almost glowing." I forced a laugh, my heart racing, wondering if they could see right through me. Another day, my mother called, her voice softer than usual as she asked if everything was okay at home. Had she sensed something? Had my voice given something away? Then there was him, my husband's best friend, the man I had risked everything for. He told me to be careful, his words edged with warning. He had noticed the way my husband had started watching, the way suspicion was creeping in. He wanted me to pull back, to be more cautious, but the secrecy was already becoming suffocating. I was balancing two lives, each one pulling me in a different direction. The thrill that had once been intoxicating now came with a lingering fear. Every moment we spent together felt like it could be the one that exposed everything. The walls were closing in, and I could feel it. It was only a matter of time before my perfect lie unravelled completely. It only took one mistake to destroy everything. For weeks I had convinced myself that I was careful, that I had control, that my husband would never suspect what was happening right under his nose. I had rehearsed every lie, covered every possible misstep, and yet the truth still found a way to escape. It was something so simple, something I should have never overlooked. A message, one that was meant to be deleted but wasn't. It sat there, on my phone, waiting to be seen. Maybe I had been careless, too confident in my ability to juggle the deception, too distracted by the rush to remember the smallest of details. But when my husband's voice called my name in that low, restrained tone, I knew before even turning around that it was over. He didn't shout, didn't rage, didn't throw accusations wildly. That would have been easier. Instead, he stood still, holding my phone in his hand, the screen glowing with undeniable proof of my betrayal. His face was unreadable, but his eyes told me everything. "Explain this," he said, his voice tight, controlled, like he was holding back something that was ready to break. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. There was no excuse that could erase what he had just seen, no lie that could twist the truth into something innocent. My silence stretched between us, louder than any confession ever could. His expression shifted then, something inside him breaking. Not anger, not even shock, just a quiet, devastating disappointment. The kind that told me that whatever we had built over the years had crumbled in an instant. I stammered something, a weak attempt to explain, to soften the blow, to justify the unjustifiable. But nothing could fix the damage that had been done. He took a deep breath, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of what he had just uncovered. And then came the words that would haunt me forever. "I trusted you." That was it. Not a scream, not a demand, just those 3 words, and somehow they hurt more than anything else he could have said. There was nothing left to say, nothing that could undo what had already been done. The affair was no longer a secret, and my husband would never look at me the same way again. The silence that followed was unbearable. My husband didn't argue, didn't fight, didn't demand explanations. He simply turned away, as if looking at me for another second would be too much to bear. I wanted to reach for him, to say something that would make this moment disappear, but nothing could undo the damage. He packed a bag that night. I watched from the doorway, my hands trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. He moved with purpose, methodical, not wasting a single motion. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, just the quiet acceptance that our marriage had already ended the moment he saw the truth. When he finally turned to face me, there was nothing left in his eyes. No anger, no sorrow, just emptiness. It was the absence of emotion that cut the deepest. If he had yelled, if he had begged for an explanation, maybe there would have been hope. But there wasn't. "I never thought you'd do this," he said. The words were quiet, controlled, but they held a weight that made my chest ache. I wanted to tell him that I never planned for any of it to happen, that I never meant to hurt him. But I knew those words meant nothing now. Intentions don't erase actions. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a finality that sent a shudder through me. Then reality set in. I expected the regret to come in waves, but instead it crashed over me all at once. The life I had known, the man who had stood by my side for years, was gone. The home we had built together suddenly felt foreign, suffocating. The weight of my choices pressed down on me with an intensity I had never felt before. The best friend, the man I had risked everything for, was nowhere to be found. He sent a message, short and impersonal, telling me that maybe it was best if we didn't see each other anymore. Just like that, he was gone. The man who had once made me feel alive, wanted, desired, had abandoned me the second it became inconvenient. Friends stopped calling. Family avoided me. The whispers followed me wherever I went. I was no longer the devoted wife, the woman people admired. I was the one who had destroyed her own marriage for something that never even lasted. And in the end, I was left with nothing but regret and an empty house that no longer felt like home. Regret settled in like an unwelcome guest, refusing to leave no matter how much I tried to push it away. I had spent so much time convincing myself that I deserved more, that I was missing something in my marriage, that I had the right to chase happiness in any form I could find. But now, as I sat alone in a house that no longer felt like home, I realized how wrong I had been. The thrill had faded, replaced with an emptiness I couldn't ignore. The excitement, the secrecy, the rush of something new, none of it meant anything now. I had traded something real for something temporary, given up a love that had been built on trust for a fleeting desire that had never been meant to last. My husband, the man who had always stood by me, no longer looked at me the same way. His absence was louder than any argument could have been. He hadn't fought, hadn't begged me to explain. He had simply walked away, and that hurt more than anything else. The silence that followed was unbearable because it meant that whatever we had was beyond saving, and the man I had risked everything for? Gone. No grand declarations, no promises of a future together, just a brief message, cold and detached, telling me it was better if we didn't speak again. I had been nothing more than a moment of weakness for him, a distraction he could discard once the damage was done. I had meant nothing. I had convinced myself that I was searching for something more, that I was reclaiming a piece of myself I had lost. But in reality, I had been running from my own fears, fear of routine, fear of feeling unseen, fear of confronting the things I didn't want to face. And instead of fixing what was broken, I had destroyed the one thing that had been worth saving. I had no one to blame but myself. The whispers, the judgment, the isolation, I had earned it all. The person I once was, the person I had prided myself on being, was gone. And as I sat there, surrounded by the consequences of my own actions, I finally understood. Some mistakes don't come with second chances. Time moved forward, but I remained frozen in the wreckage of my choices. My husband had left, carrying with him the love and trust we had built over the years. I had watched as he walked away, his silence louder than any argument could have been. There were no second chances, no last-minute pleas, just the reality that some betrayals cut too deep to be forgiven. I had told myself I was searching for something more, but I had never considered what I was willing to lose in the process. Now I could see the truth clearly. I hadn't been missing love. I had been missing appreciation, communication, and honesty. But instead of fixing what had grown distant, I had broken it beyond repair. My husband was moving on. I heard about it through mutual friends, saw glimpses of his new life in the spaces where ours used to overlap. He looked lighter, free from the weight I had placed on his shoulders. He had left the past behind, while I was still trapped in it. The whispers around me had faded, but the consequences remained. Friends who once stood by my side now kept their distance, their trust in me shattered. Family no longer looked at me the same way, their disappointment a quiet reminder of what I had thrown away. I had made myself the villain of my own story, and there was no rewriting it. And the man I had risked everything for? He had disappeared without a trace. No calls, no messages, no attempts to hold on to what we had started. It became painfully clear that I had never been special to him. I had been a distraction, an escape, nothing more. And now that my life was in ruins, he was nowhere to be found. I had thought I was helping, that I was offering comfort to someone who needed me. But in the end, all I had done was destroy myself. I had sacrificed something real for something fleeting, mistaking attention for love, excitement for meaning. And now I was left with nothing but regret. Some mistakes can be forgiven, some wounds can heal, but some choices leave scars that never fade.